I was asked to speak today to look at public health issues and how they might be of interest to you as people who are pretty much working in the workplace and dealing with occupational workplace hazards. So in trying to think about how I might be able to assist you in talking about sort of public health space, I thought about, how maybe what we do in public health might help you in the way you think and solve problems in the work health and safety environment. So I'm going to go through some sort of basic principles. And I think, there's some themes of today is that we have hazards that we have to deal with in the workplace, and we have some new and emerging hazards with radiation, some known hazards with silica. And an emerging theme I'm hearing is at what point do we start to take action about exposure, and what kind of action do we take? And I'm hoping some of what I'm addressing today might help you with thinking through those things. And the valuable thing about taking a day out like today is it allows us to take a breath. I can do puns too, Matt. And think about what we do and why we do it, and how those principles that we use can help us solve some of the problems that we face. So as an occupational and environmental professional in my career, what I've learned is that there is an opportunity to be able to cross over. Big green button is what I'm doing, okay, thank you very much. Is to cross over the discipline areas and learn from each other and learn from the two disciplines. So I'm going to start with looking at what are the principles and demonstrate maybe some of the similarities and how public health principles can complement WHS and how they might be able to aid in decision making. And some of these principles you're already using. The middle part of my talk will look at some common health hazards that we might face that are common in both public health settings and in workplace settings. And finally, I'll just talk a little bit about risk management and risk communication, although that will be prevalent throughout the presentation. So looking at the guiding principle of the WHS Act, basically workers and other people, they need to be given the highest level of protection against harm. So I think this is relevant to some of the points that were raised about precise measurement of exposure. Precise measurement of exposure is good where you can get it, but actually our guiding principle that is supposed to guide us is to give the highest level of protection. So where we know about the hazard and we know what to do to prevent exposure, then that's what should be our focus, rather than arguing about how precise is our measuring method and does it get to the exposure limit that we're really interested in. We're really trying to minimise exposure so far as is reasonably practicable. And this idea of so far as reasonably practicable is explored also in public health guiding principles. We all know about the precautionary principle. We talked about it earlier this morning. And that basically says if there's a public health risk or any other kind of risk, a lack of scientific uncertainty shouldn't be used as the reason to postpone measures to prevent, control or abate that risk, especially where we know what those control measures should be. And in applying the precautionary principle, decision-making should be guided by a really careful evaluation to avoid, where practical, harm to health, and an assessment of the risk-weighted consequences of the options. And I think it's, when we talked about, Tracy talked about silica and stone workers, basically we know that the risk to them, particularly as a workforce, as a job task, is very high. So there's a really strong argument for elimination and substitution in that space. But then what about silica exposure for tunnelling, construction and other activities? Do we ban silica there? Well, that's where maybe we need to start looking at some of those risk-weighted options and actually apply some other control measures to minimise exposure. The sustainability principle in public health, I also find, you can use this in work health and safety as well in your decisions and actions. So in public health, we need to be guided not only to what benefits people today, but also making sure there aren't adverse effects for people in the future. Our radiation example is, an example of that. Are we contaminating the environment? And we talk about cost effectiveness and being in proportion to the significance of the risks. That's very much captured in public health regulation as something that we have to do. Public health regulation also talks about the principle of proportionality. so that our decisions and responses should be made in proportionate to the public health risk to be prevented, controlled or abated. And those measures should have the least adverse impact on the individual, business or community. And you certainly saw this through COVID in terms of trying to make sure that the decisions about protecting us against COVID and weighing those decisions up against what impacts they would have on individuals, businesses and communities. And often, as you could see, weighing those costs and benefits can be quite difficult. And that was a time I was very happy not to be the Chief Health Officer, having to make that call about, you know, what are the competing interests and how should we make that call. There's a couple of other principles. So we have a lot of principles under the Public Health Act, as you can see. There was one for WHS, but there's no reason why you can't use these principles in your work. One is about intergenerational equity, so making sure that we look after future generations again. And the other is a lot of public health regulation involves local government who administer our regulation. So there's a principle in our Act, Public Health Act, about being respectful of the functions of local government in relation to their role in the protection of public health and acknowledging their role. Again, just to, you know, take a breath and go back at what are the objects of what we do. Certainly with WHS, the objects recognise that there are risks that we have to manage, and the focus is on minimising the risk. And when we do that, we have to do that in an environment of consultation and cooperation with the workers. We need to provide advice, information, education and training. Public health extends beyond and goes into promotion and improvement of health and wellbeing in their objects. And I think we can start to see how in workplaces we're using some of those public health principles and objects in the workplaces through things like wellbeing programs and fitness programs that are being introduced into workplaces that also work well, so that synergy between public health and work health and safety can be brought in. Now I'm going to focus a little bit on some of the common environmental health hazards. I work within the Environmental Health Directorate, Department of Health, and we deal with physical, chemical and biological pollutants that can cause harm to the public. Starting off, here's a picture of asbestos management in the workplace. Obviously, we are minimising absolutely exposure. We've got a number of control methods in place there. That's a bonded product, but we're fully kitted up. We've isolated the area. The workers know what they're doing. They've obviously been trained, they're supervised. And then here's a picture of asbestos in the public health and community setting. So as you can see, it's a slightly different picture. So this is a class 1 carcinogen, a very important hazard, and one that is well managed in the workplace and not so well managed outside of the workplace. So there is a health asbestos regulations that we have under the public health regulations, but as you can imagine, as people start to forget about asbestos or become complacent about asbestos, some exposures can continue to occur. So it's an area that we have to maintain very strong focus and attention. So with asbestos, the sale and supply is prohibited through the public health regulations, the health asbestos regulations. People can only maintain or repair an asbestos cement product. They can't really remove it or move it. They can only remove asbestos cement products for the purposes of disposal. If they do any maintenance work and they remove 1 or 2 sheets, that's okay, but they have to be reinstated and only if they're in good condition. So those rules are currently under the health asbestos regulation, so you do need to pay attention to asbestos at home. The regulations, similar to work health and safety regulations, really aim to minimise exposure to airborne fibres, and so it does make it an offence for a person to store, break, damage, cut, do any activity basically without taking reasonable measures to prevent asbestos fibres entering the atmosphere. And a local government authorised officer can serve a notice on the owner or the person undertaking the activity to make sure that activity ceases, or to basically ask that person, give them direction to maintain, repair, remove or dispose or handle the material containing asbestos in a manner and within such a time as is specified in the direction. The usefulness of these regulations is that, although much of it deals with asbestos cement products, these regulations, because that's much of what we find in the public environment, The ability to give a direction for any material containing asbestos means that local government authorised officers can take action where there's been a fire and there's friable material, or other situation where there's been accidental damage, high water pressure, hosing of roofs, which causes quite significant contamination. They can actually serve directions associated with those kind of contaminations as well. And also the regs need you to do the same things you do in WHS legislation, which is separate, contain and transport waste appropriately. The other thing I want to quickly go through is contamination of the environment. So this is a way in which people can be exposed to inhalation hazards and also other means of exposure to hazardous substances. Obviously, you have industrial emissions and discharges, and we've talked a little bit about that today, about mining and how that can cause a legacy issue or can cause an effect outside the boundary. So having good regulation of air emissions and discharges through licensing through our environmental agency is important, but sometimes there is off-site release and there needs to be a way of managing that. There is the Contaminated Sites Act in WA, which manages any kind of contamination that occurs on land. Another way in people that can be exposed is from contamination on land, where there's a change in land use. So then you might actually be exposed not just through sort of groundwater or air, which can go off-site, but also through soil, growing things in the soil, eating produce from the soil. And I thought one of the things that might be useful to you is this idea of building a conceptual site model about what is the source of your hazards, what are the exposure pathways and what are the receptors. So source exposure pathway receptor model is one that Dino referred to this morning, and I think it's a really useful model to sort of again go back to basics sometimes and go, what is our source, what is our exposure pathway, who are our receptors, and where can we break the chain of exposure? So again, how this is about minimising our exposure to hazards. Do we need to actually really measure exposure, or can we actually break the pathway or break the connection between the source and the receptor so that people aren't getting exposed to these hazards? An interesting contaminant that everyone is kind of talking about right now is per- and polyfluoroalkyl substances. These are a group of chemicals, over 40,000 chemicals. They're being used in a range of applications, everything from the greaseproof paper that wrapped your burger, to stain guard material, protective guarding material for your clothing. So it's kind of been used a lot. And so everyone has had some exposure to PFAS because it's been in consumer products. Why are they a problem? Well, they're a problem because they're persistent in the environment, they stay in the environment, they accumulate, they're bioaccumulative, and there's some evidence of adverse effects. So as soon as you see a persistent organic pollutant like this, you basically want to try and manage and minimise exposure because it's just not a good idea to have these in the environment. However, with PFAS, unlike asbestos, which is a class 1 carcinogen, silica, which is a class 1 carcinogen, the evidence of health effects is somewhat more limited with these substances with regard to actual disease causation. There's been research that shows some association with some effects, including cholesterol changes, changes in kidney function and hormones, but there hasn't been a really great causative link shown. Nevertheless, they are persistent pollutants. They take a long time to break down in the human body and in the environment, so Australia is taking action to make sure that we eliminate and substitute with other chemicals that don't have these undesirable properties, so using the precautionary principle. And increased levels of PFAS have been found near fire training grounds, effluent outfalls and landfill sites. So the approach to PFAS, because of the precautionary approach, is to minimise exposure. But how far do we go to minimise exposure? And this is probably it probably gives us a good example of where we need to think about proportionate control. We know, for example, that we all have PFAS in our blood. Does that mean that we should, for example, stop breastfeeding and not pass these PFAS on to our children? Well, actually, there's very strong and very good evidence that breastfeeding is highly beneficial for your child, even though people have had PFAS in their blood over, a few decades. So the public health advice, has to weigh the risks up. And the resultant of that weighing up of risks is saying, well, there isn't really enough evidence to say that we should stop breastfeeding. Given overall the total benefit of breastfeeding, continue to breastfeed your child, while minimising your exposure to PFAS in other ways and still being precautionary. So that balance of weighing up your options becomes important, but then it becomes a bit of a risk communication nightmare, because then you're having to explain why you can do one activity and not another activity when it's all about minimising exposure. Metals is another thing I want to touch on, and I'm sort of aware that we're getting close to lunch, so I think most of you know about metals, so I'll go through this quite quickly. So there are sources of metal exposure outside of work, and that might be because people are undertaking business activities at work that may lead to an exposure to their family. They may be undertaking hobbies like pottery, glazing, lead lighting, fishing, repairing their own sinkers, going shooting and coming home without getting changed, or preparing at home, welding, and other jobs that might, and hobbies that might lead to exposure to metals. We've all heard about lead in plumbing fixtures, which is also a potential source of exposure. And then there's the problem of bringing home contamination from the workplace. So if you're working in a fire assay lab or a foundry, are you using or taking advantage of, or using best practices and taking advantage of what you have in the workplace to protect yourself? You know, are you wearing other clothes in the workplace, showering and changing before leaving work, using laundering facilities where they're provided, or have you become familiar with the risk? Your workers become familiar with the risk and they're kind of slacking off on the hygiene. So maintaining good hygiene is important. You don't want to be taking home dirty clothes to your family, to your home. You want to be making sure you enforce those, you know, good hygiene practices with your workers. And there is a notification, just to let you know about the Public Health Act again, there is a notification requirement for people that might have elevated lead levels, and that does get notified to us. And we do undertake investigations, which is how we know that shooting, for example, is a particular problem in WA. We get quite a lot of lead notifications around people who go to gun ranges and then don't practice good hygiene at the gun range, or take their child who then also has an elevated lead level. So we have a fact sheet on that if you're interested in looking at that on our website. Dino very adequately covered indoor air quality, so I'll just sort of touch on this. This is those standards there from the National Construction Code on the side, and I won't go through them, but they are lower than WHS standards. Now you've got to remember, with a time-weighted average, it assumes that you have some unexposed time. Now unexposed time, well, we can't get away from air contaminants, can we? But so there are public health guidelines that are way lower than the occupational guidelines. So we need to make sure that when people are in their crib rooms, in their office areas, that we don't apply the Work Health and Safety TWA to those locations. We apply the public health guideline locations, because that should be their rest, their breathe easy space. So that's when we should be thinking about, well, we need to make sure that exposures are even lower in those parts of their environment, inside their offices, inside their crib rooms, than out on the tools. Moulds is very common in both workplaces and homes. There's both Healthy WA, or Health, and Department of Mines Industry DMIRS have information on mould, which I suggest you look at. The main source of mould, or the main problem with mould, comes from moisture and dampness, so they're the key factors for mould growth. You know, when media gets a hold of a story, which you would have seen recently, you know, black toxic mould found. All mould can be harmful, doesn't matter the colour, but that sort of gets really good media attention. So there are health effects that can result from different types and colours of moulds. The advice we give to people is that any visible mould should be removed, but more importantly, the source of the moisture or dampness that led to the mould growth should be tackled, and there's a lot more information in the guidelines. Indoor air quality, we had quite a lot of learnings from COVID, and again, Dino very ably took us through this. When we talk about what provisions there are in public health legislation, we do actually have public health building regulations. Now, normally these aren't used with regard to the ventilation provision, but you'll see there's a certificate of approval or a certificate of occupancy that can be issued for buildings. And it usually looks at the accommodation of the number of people that are permitted under these building regulations. So there is actually scope for us already for authorised officers in local government to use some of these modern monitoring sensor techniques, CO2 or other, and say, hey, the number of people in this room, the kind of activity they're doing, which is a lot of exhaled breath, maybe they're doing some, like maybe it's a gym and they're doing a lot of physical activity, is creating a problem with excess contaminants in this space. Excess carbon dioxide is kind of related to how much we're exhaling of potential airborne respiratory viruses. So a public health officer could potentially whack an occupancy certificate that is less than what would normally be allowed in that room to allow for adequate dilution or air change ventilation in that room for the number of people in that room. So there are things like that we're talking about in the public health setting. We're certainly talking about indoor air quality on a national scale amongst environmental health professionals. So I think it's a bit of watch this space, because we are trying to kind of, not lose the momentum gained by COVID to do something about improved indoor air quality. And again, when you look at, proportionate response and principles, not only can we reduce airborne respiratory hazards, but we can also reduce all those other harmful effects from indoor air quality, from poor indoor air quality that can happen. So there's a cohesive response to that. I was going to talk a bit more around the COVID situation, but I think Dino, again, has covered this. I mean, we do know that close contact facilitates multiple pathways of transmission. It's still the highest risk of becoming infected, but we also know from studies undertaken through COVID that transmission, or more long-range transmission, is possible, and reducing the relative risk of that kind of transmission is possible through good ventilation. We always go back to risk management, and we've seen both of these before, so I won't go into them. We do apply the hierarchy of control, elimination substitution where something is really bad, the rest of the hierarchy where we can, and we always think about these two things together, not just the hierarchy, but how we can combine all our controls from our hierarchy to have a more effective response to minimising exposure, being our Swiss cheese model, which was done by James Reason. And if you want to have a look at how we went from the 4 bits of slices of cheese that Dino had to the numerous slices of cheeses we now have in this picture, that's a very nice little reference about how this infograph evolved and went viral, created by an Australian, so we can be proud of that. Okay. Risk communication is also very important, and I'll just finish on this slide. Risk communication is difficult in both settings, whether you're in the workplace environment or a public health community environment. It's difficult in both settings. There is often a need to distinguish between here's a hazard and what is the risk to that exposure to that hazard. Just knowing there's a hazard there can be really scary and terrifying and frightening, but what is the actual risk of disease or harm occurring from exposure? We need to be able to communicate that properly. We always talk about risk in terms of likelihood and impact, but really because we need to communicate about risks, we need to understand that other things affect our evaluation of the risk, and commonly these are, what is our familiarity with the hazard? Are we over familiar with it so we don't realise it's a danger? Like some people with asbestos, they're over familiar with it so they don't realise it's a danger. Then there are others that are very concerned about it. What's our tolerance to risk? Some people are more tolerant than others. If there are children as receptors, that usually gets us a bit excited. Is it manufactured versus is it natural? Natural products can be toxic and harmful too. Evaluation of the fairness of the exposure and whether or not effects are immediate. Thank you. I'll end there because we want to get to lunch, don't we?
Thank you very much indeed. Thanks, Pierina.